The morning of the auction, there were 300 sheep nobody wanted. They stood packed into a muddy holding pen at the back of the Caldwell County stockyard, breath rising off them in the cold like steam from a kettle. Wool matted and gray and knotted with burrs, and every man who walked past them turned his head away, as if the sight offended him personally. It was the last week of November, and a hard frost had come early that year, silvering the fences and the truck windshields and the backs of the animals nobody had bid on. The seller was a bank man in a canvas coat who had never once in his life stood inside a sheep pen. And he was there only because the flock had come to the bank the way most things came to the bank, through a foreclosure, through a family that had run out of road. He wanted them gone. He had priced them for parts, so to speak, and even at that price no hand had gone up. And then a girl not yet 22 walked up to the rail and looked at them for a long time without saying anything at all. Her name was Ada Renner, and she looked at those sheep the way other people look at weather coming, quiet and steady, reading something in them that the men leaning on the fence could not see. She did not climb the rail. She did not poke at them or run her hands down their legs the way the cattle buyers did. She just stood with her hands in the pockets of a coat that had belonged to a dead man, and she watched them shift and mill and lean into one another for warmth. Somebody laughed. It was Dale Pruitt, who ran 400 acres of good bottomland east of the river and never let anybody forget it, and he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, that the only thing those animals were good for was dog food, and the dog would complain. A couple of the feed store men chuckled along with him. Ada did not turn around. When the auctioneer, half embarrassed, asked if anybody wanted to make an offer just to clear the pen, she raised one finger and said $7, and Dale Pruitt laughed so hard he had to take his cap off, and told her she had just overpaid for 300 head of trouble. If this story means something to you before it's even started, do me a small kindness and tap that like button, because it helps more folks like you find stories like this one. And tell me down in the comments what city or town you're watching from right now, because I read every single one, and I like to know where in the world these stories are landing. Then stay with me, because what happened to those 300 freezing sheep and to the girl who paid $7 for them is not the story anybody standing at that fence would have guessed. Now let's begin. Ada Renner had come back to Caldwell County 8 months before the auction, and she had not come back because she had a plan. She had come back because her grandmother had fallen and there was no one else, and because the apartment in the city had a lease she was glad to be rid of, and because some part of her that she did not examine too closely had always known she would end up on that ridge again. The Renner place sat at the head of a hollow called Sudden, a name nobody could explain anymore. 40 acres of steep pasture and thin soil, and a farmhouse that had been white once and was now the color of an old dog's muzzle. Her grandfather had died when she was 15, and her grandmother, Wilma, had gone on running the place alone in the stubborn way of women who have outlived everyone who told them they couldn't. When Ada arrived, Wilma was 84 and moved like a person conserving something, but her eyes had lost none of their edge, and the first thing she said to her granddaughter was not hello, but you're thinner than you ought to be. Ada carried her bags inside and started cooking, and neither of them mentioned the word staying, and both of them understood it had already been decided. The farm had run cattle once, and before that it had run sheep back in her great-grandfather's day, but the pastures had gone half to cedar, and the fences sagged, and there was almost no money in the coffee can where the money had always been kept. Ada spent that first spring and summer just holding things together, patching what could be patched, learning the geography of a place she thought she'd known. She discovered that she noticed things. She noticed which corners of the pasture the grass came back to first, and which way the wind broke over the ridge, and how the old barn her great-grandfather built stood dead square and true after 90 winters while the newer sheds sagged and leaked. She kept a notebook, a cheap spiral thing from the drugstore, and she wrote in it without any clear reason the dates of the first frost, the price of feed, the names of the neighbors and what they thought of her, which was mostly that a city girl would not last. She let them think it. She had learned long ago that the fastest way to lose an argument was to have it, and the fastest way to win one was to wait. It was Wilma who first said the word wool, though she said it sideways, the way she said most important things. They were sitting on the porch one August evening, the light going gold and long across the hollow, and Ada was reading aloud from a letter that had come from the bank, a polite letter, the kind that means the opposite of what it says. Wilma listened with her eyes closed, and then she said, out of nowhere, that her father had never once bought a blanket in his life. Ada looked up. Wilma said he sheared his own, carded it, and Ada's great-grandmother spun it, and the blankets they made lasted 3 generations and were warmer than anything you could buy in a store, and that people had forgotten what real wool even was because they had been sold cheap thin stuff their whole lives and had nothing to compare it to. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. Then she said the sentence Ada would come back to 100 times in the years ahead. She said, "The old breeds are gone from around here now. Everybody chased the ones that grew fast and gained weight, and they let the ones that grew good wool die out because wool wasn't worth anything." She opened her eyes and looked at her granddaughter and said, "But a thing isn't worthless. It's just waiting for somebody to need it again." Then she went inside and went to bed, and Ada sat on the porch until the stars came out, and she did not know yet that a door had opened. She went looking after that, the way she did everything, slowly and without telling anyone. In the attic of the farmhouse, in a trunk that smelled of cedar and thyme, she found her great-grandfather's records, ledgers written in a cramped upright hand, and among the columns of dollars and pounds she found pages that were not accounts at all, but a kind of manual. Notes on the sheep he'd kept, which he called by an old breed name she'd never heard. Notes on how their wool had a long staple and a spring to it, and how it took dye and shed rain. Notes on the way to skirt a fleece and sort it and wash it so it kept its life. He had written, near the end of one page, a line that stopped her cold. He had written, "When the fast money is gone, the slow money will still be here in the wool. Tell whoever comes after. Don't let them tell you it's worthless." She read that line 3 times. She copied it into her drugstore notebook, and she understood, sitting on the attic floor in the dust, that her great-grandfather had been talking to her across 60 years, and that he had known, the way farmers know things, that a day like this one would come. She did not do anything foolish. She did not run out and buy sheep. She spent the whole autumn learning, reading everything she could find, driving 2 hours to a fiber festival where women with silver hair and quick hands showed her the difference between wool that was grown for weight and wool that was grown for warmth. And she took her great-grandfather's breed name to one of them, an old woman spinning at a wheel, and the woman's face changed. "That's a heritage breed," she said. "Nobody keeps them anymore. They don't gain fast enough for the meat market, and the wool market crashed 40 years ago, so nobody could sell the fleece. So the breed nearly died out." She looked at Ada and said, "But they're wool. There's nothing like it, if you could ever find any." Ada wrote the breed name in her notebook and underlined it twice, and she did not know then that 300 head of that very breed were standing in a foreclosure pen 60 miles away, going to a bank that had priced them by the pound because it did not know what it had. She heard about the auction the way you hear about everything in the county at the feed store, where the men gathered around the wood stove and traded news like currency. She heard one of them say a whole flock of some junk breed had come to the bank in the Hollis foreclosure. Useless things, slow-growing, nobody would touch them, and the bank was going to more or less give them away, just to empty the pen before the cold got them. She heard the word bank and the word giveaway, and something in her went very still. She asked, casually, "What breed?" And the man told her. and it was the name in her notebook, the name underlined twice, the name her great-grandfather had written across 60 years. She did not say anything. She finished loading her feed, and she drove home, and she sat with Wilma at the kitchen table and told her. Wilma listened. Then Wilma got up and went to the coffee can and counted out what was in it, which was not much, and set it on the table and said one word. She said, "Go." The morning of the auction was the morning we started with, the frost and the steam and the 300 head of matted gray sheep that nobody wanted, and Dale Pruitt laughing so hard he had to take his cap off. What Dale Pruitt did not know, what none of them knew, was that under the mud and the burrs and the neglect of a family that had given up, those animals carried on their backs the one thing this county had thrown away and would before very long be desperate to have back. Ada paid her $7. She paid a hauler 40 more, which was 6 times what the sheep had cost, to run them up to the ridge in 3 trips, and the hauler, an old man named Corliss, shook his head the whole way and said she'd bought herself a graveyard, that half of them wouldn't make it through December looking like that. She said that's one approach, and looked out the window at the hills going by, and said nothing else. That night the first of them came up the loading ramp into her great-grandfather's 90-year-old barn and stood in the clean straw under the square true beams, and Ada stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long time in the lantern light before she said out loud to no one, "Welcome home." The first winter nearly broke her, and she would not have told you otherwise, because she did not lie to herself, and she did not decorate the truth. 300 neglected animals is 300 animals worth of trouble, and she learned every kind of trouble that season. She learned to trim rotted hooves in the freezing dark, her hands so cold she couldn't feel the knife. She learned which ewes were sick and which were only frightened, and she learned the hard way the difference between a sheep that will live and a sheep that has already decided not to, and she lost 11 of them in December, and it hurt every time even though she did not name them. She held that line mostly. She almost held that line. There were 2, an old ewe with a torn ear and a young one that wouldn't leave the old one's side, that she started calling names for in her head. And when the old one made it to spring, Ada felt a gladness out of all proportion to the fact of one surviving sheep. Wilma watched all of it from the kitchen window and said little, and once, when Ada came in at 2 in the morning gray with cold, having pulled a lamb that nobody expected to come, Wilma had coffee waiting and did not say good job because she did not say things like that. She said, "Your great-grandfather would have sat up too," which was the same thing from her. By March the flock had turned a corner. The 11 were gone, but the other 289 had come through, and something remarkable was happening on their backs. Cared for, fed properly out of the mud, the wool that had been matted and gray was growing in clean underneath, and Ada, running her fingers down the flank of the torn-eared ewe one warm afternoon, felt it for the first time as the women at the festival had described it, a long, springy staple with a life to it, a crimp that held together, a warmth that seemed to come up out of the fiber itself. She stood there in the pasture with her hand full of wool, and she understood, in her body and not just her head, what her great-grandfather had written. This was not the thin, cheap stuff the world had learned to settle for. This was the thing itself. She took a lock of it inside and laid it on the kitchen table under the good light, and Wilma looked at it and touched it and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "That's it. That's what my father grew." And her voice was not quite steady, which for Wilma was a flood. Shearing came in April, and Ada did not know how to shear, so she paid a man 2 counties over who still knew the old way with hand blades, because she had read that machine shearing cut the staple too short, and he came for 3 days and taught her as he worked, and by the 3rd day she was doing it herself, slow and clumsy and improving. When it was done, she had close to 800 pounds of raw fleece piled in the 90-year-old barn, and she sorted it exactly the way her great-grandfather's ledger described, skirting away the dirty edges, sorting by grade, by the length of the staple, laying it out so it kept its loft. Corliss the hauler came by to see if the graveyard he'd predicted had filled up, and instead he found a barn full of wool and a girl who looked 10 years older than she had in November, and he stood in the doorway and took off his hat, not to laugh this time, and he said, "Well, I'll be." He picked up a handful of the sorted fleece and worked it between his fingers, and something crossed his weathered face, some memory, and he said, "My mother used to knit with wool like this. Haven't felt anything like it in 50 years. Ada watched him, and she wrote that night in her notebook, in her cheap spiral notebook, a single line. She wrote, Corliss remembered, and underneath it she wrote, "They will all remember." But remembering and buying are two different things, and Ada learned that fast. She washed a batch of the wool by hand in the big galvanized tubs, the way the ledger said, "cold water and patience," and she dried it, and she took 40 pounds of it, cleaned and carded and beautiful, to the county in her grandfather's rattling truck, and she found out that the wool market her festival friend had told her about was every bit as dead as promised. The one buyer who took wool at all, a broker who trucked it off to somewhere far away to be blended into nothing in particular, offered her a price so low it wouldn't have covered the gas to bring it to him. He didn't grade it. He didn't touch it, really. He weighed it and named a number, and the number was an insult. And when Ada didn't take it, he shrugged and said, "That's the market, honey. Wool's worthless, has been for years, and you'll learn that the same as everybody else did." That was the phrase, "Wool's worthless." She heard it that spring more times than she could count. She heard it from the broker, and she heard it echoed at the feed store, and she heard it, most memorably, from Dale Pruitt, who pulled up beside her at the gas station in his big, clean truck and rolled down his window and said, "Still got them sheep?" And when she said she did, he shook his head with something like pity and delivered the sentence that this whole story exists to disprove. He said, "That ground of yours never grew anything worth selling, and it never will. You're pouring good years into a thing that leads nowhere." He said it not cruelly, but as a man offering a hard fact for her consideration, the way he'd tell you a bridge was out. Ada looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll let you know how it goes." And she drove home with 40 pounds of wool nobody would pay for sitting in the seat beside her. And she was not discouraged, or if she was, she did not show it, because she had already understood the thing that would carry her. She had understood that she did not have to sell the wool the way the market sold wool. The market sold it by the pound to people who didn't care. She was going to sell it the way her great-grandmother had used it, made into something, into warmth you could hold, to people who would care very much once they felt it. She just had to find them one at a time, and that, she knew, was going to be slow. She started with one blanket. She could not spin well enough yet, and she could not weave at all, so she drove the 2 hours to the Fiber Festival and found the silver-haired woman from before, whose name was Ruth, and she laid a fleece on the table and said, "Teach me, or make me one, or both." Ruth ran her hands through the wool and went quiet the way people kept going quiet around that wool, and she said she would do both, that she would weave the first blanket herself from Ada's wool if Ada would drive up and learn the craft alongside her, because a fiber like this deserved hands that knew what they were doing, and Ada's didn't yet. So through that summer, Ada drove north 1 day a week, and she learned to card and to spin and to set a warp, and back home she practiced in the evenings by the light of the same lamp her great-grandmother had spun by, and Wilma watched, and once took the spindle from her hands and showed her a twist of the wrist that made the yarn come even, a thing her own mother had shown her 70 years before. And Ada wrote in her notebook that the knowledge had not been lost after all. It had only been sleeping in an old woman's hands, waiting to be asked. By August, the first blanket was finished. It was Ruth's weaving and Ada's wool, and it was, without exaggeration, the warmest and most beautiful thing either of them had ever handled. Dense and soft and alive, the natural gray of the sheep with a band of the darker wool at each end. Ada brought it home and laid it over Wilma's knees on the porch, and Wilma pulled it up to her chin and closed her eyes. And she stayed like that so long Ada thought she'd fallen asleep. And then Wilma said, without opening her eyes, "My mother's blankets felt just like this." And that was the whole of her review, and it was everything. Ada sold the second blanket, and the third, and the fourth, and she did not sell them by advertising, because she had no money to advertise and no faith in it anyway. She sold them the way things had always been sold in Caldwell County, by one person telling another. The first went to Ruth's daughter, who took it to her office in the city and would not stop talking about it, and a woman from that office drove all the way out to Sudden Hollow to buy one for her mother and got lost twice on the ridge roads and said the drive was worth it the moment she felt the wool. Ada priced them fairly but not cheaply, because she had done the arithmetic in her drugstore notebook and knew what the wool was worth once you understood it, and she found, to the quiet astonishment of everyone but herself, that people would pay it. They would pay it because they had spent their whole lives buying thin, cheap blankets that pilled and shed and never quite kept the cold out, and they had nothing to compare it to until they had this. And once they had this, they understood at last what they had been missing. The word moved the way words move in the country, slow and sure and impossible to stop, from a kitchen to a church to a beauty parlor to the gas station where Loretta ran the register and knew everything about everyone. Loretta got hold of one of the blankets through her sister, and she talked about it to every soul who came through her door. And the gas station, it turned out, was a more powerful engine of commerce than anything the broker with the low prices had ever imagined, because Loretta believed in the thing, and Loretta had opinions, and Loretta shared them with the whole moving river of the county. By October of that second year, Ada had a waiting list. She had never intended to have a waiting list, and she did not entirely know what to do with one. So she did the only thing she knew, which was to keep it in the notebook, names and dates in her plain upright hand that had come, she noticed, to look more and more like her great-grandfather's. She could not make blankets fast enough, and Ruth could not weave them fast enough, and so Ada did what she always did, which was to think slowly and refuse to rush. She did not borrow money to buy a mill. She did not scale up the way Dale Pruitt would have told her to scale up if Dale Pruitt had had any interest in helping her, which he did not yet. Instead, she found the helpers the way she'd found everything, one at a time. There was a girl named Josie, 16, whose family had lost their own place and who came looking for work with the flat, hard face of someone braced to be turned away. And Ada put her on the wool, washing and carding, and found she had good hands and a good eye, and taught her the way Ruth had taught her, one day at a time. There was an old man in town, a retired schoolteacher named Barrett, who had wintered his whole life with a loom in his spare room and no one to weave for, and when he heard about the wool he came out to the ridge and wove a sample and wept, quietly, when he was done, and said he had waited 30 years for wool worth his time. Ada gave him all he could weave. The operation grew the way a tree grows, from the inside, adding a ring at a time, and it never once got ahead of itself, and it never once owed the bank $1, which Ada considered privately the sweetest part of all. She kept the flock the same way. She did not double it or triple it to chase the demand. She grew it slowly, keeping her best ewes, breeding for the wool the way her great-grandfather's ledger taught her, culling honestly. And every spring the shearing yielded a little more and a little better, and every spring the wool got a reputation a little wider. The torn-eared ewe, the one she had almost named, threw twin ewe lambs that second spring, whose fleece, when it came in, was the finest on the place, and Ada wrote in her notebook, "Those are the ones," and kept them, and they became the mothers of everything that followed. She had understood, without anyone teaching her, the thing that separates a farm that lasts from a farm that flares up and burns out. She had understood that you let the demand pull the growth, and you never push growth ahead of what the land and the animals can honestly give, and you build small enough that a bad year cannot end you. Her great-grandfather had known it. He had written it in his cramped hand between the columns of an old ledger, and now his great-granddaughter was living it, and the past and the present had folded together on that ridge into a single continuous thing, which is the closest a person ever comes to defeating time. The turn in the county came slowly, and then 1 week seemed to come all at once. It was the third winter, and the third winter brought the storm. It came down out of the northwest with almost no warning, the way the worst ones do, and it dropped 2 feet of snow, and then the temperature fell to a place it had not fallen in 40 years. So cold the pipes burst in half the houses in the county, and the power went out for 6 days across every hollow, and the state trucks could not keep the roads open faster than the snow closed them. People burned furniture. Old folks froze in their own beds in the dark hollows where no one could reach them, and 2 of them died, and the county learned again a lesson it had allowed itself to forget, which was that warmth is not a small thing, that warmth is the whole thing, that a person can live without almost anything for a week except heat, and the people who had Ada Renner's blankets, the few dozen of them scattered across the county, discovered during those 6 freezing powerless nights exactly what they had bought. They discovered that the wool held the heat of a body the way nothing else they owned could, that a person under one of those blankets stayed warm through a night with no furnace and no fire, that the thing kept them alive in a way that was not a figure of speech. And when the power came back and the roads opened and the county crawled out to take stock of what the storm had done, there was only one thing anyone wanted to talk about, and it was the wool. Loretta at the gas station said afterward that she had never seen anything like the week after the storm. People came in not for gas, but for information, and the information they wanted was, "Where do I get one of those blankets?" And Loretta, who had been telling them for 2 years and been half ignored, now had the pure vindicated joy of telling them again and being believed. The waiting list in Ada's drugstore notebook, which had held a dozen names, held 200 by the end of that month, and then it held so many that Ada had to start a second notebook. And the thing that had been called worthless for 40 years, the thing the broker weighed and insulted, the thing Dale Pruitt had laughed at till he had to take off his cap, was suddenly the most sought-after object in Caldwell County, not because anyone had argued for it, but because reality had made the argument itself, in the plainest possible terms, over 6 freezing nights. Ada did not gloat. She did not raise her prices to punish the ones who had doubted, though she could have. She simply worked, and hired 2 more helpers, and kept the flock growing at its own honest pace, and let the demand pull the thing forward the way she always had. She wrote in her notebook one night that week a line she did not underline, because she did not need to. She wrote, "They needed it after all." Dale Pruitt came up the ridge in the middle of that hard, cold February, which was the last thing Ada expected. She heard the big truck before she saw it, laboring up the icy grade in low gear, and she went out onto the porch and watched him get out, and he stood by his truck for a minute not saying anything, holding his cap in his hands, the way men do when they've come to say something difficult. He was not a bad man. He had only been a conventional one, a man who believed what everyone believed because believing it had always worked out fine for him. And it is a particular kind of hard for a man like that to stand in the cold and admit that the world had turned out to be larger than his certainty. He said his wife had gotten one of the blankets from her sister before Christmas, and that during the storm, when the power was out and the little propane heater gave out on the second night, that blanket had been the only warm thing in the house, and that they had put his mother under it, who was 90 and frail, and would not, he said, his voice going rough, would not have made it through those nights without it. He looked out over the pasture where the flock stood dark against the snow, contentedly warm in their own wool, and he said, I told you this ground never grew anything worth selling." He said it plainly, offering it back to her, the way he had offered it as a fact 2 years before. Then he said, "I was wrong about that. He did not make a large production of it. He was not a man who could have. He just said it, and stood with his cap in his hands. And then he said, 'If you ever want to run more of 'em, I've got 40 acres of bottomland going to waste, and I'd rent it to you cheap, or I'd run them on shares, whatever suits you.'" And Ada looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at the sheep at the auction, reading him. And then she said, "I'll let you know how it goes," which was the same thing she'd said to him at the gas station, the exact same words, and she saw that he remembered them, and she saw that he understood, and something passed between them that was better than an apology, because it did not need to be spoken. He put his cap back on and got in his truck and backed carefully down the icy grade, and Ada went back inside where Wilma was sitting by the wood stove with the very first blanket over her knees, and she told her, and Wilma said, "Took 'em long enough." And that was all either of them said about Dale Pruitt for a long time. But Ada noticed that spring that she did rent his bottomland after all, and that she and Dale got along fine as neighbors, and that he never once tried to tell her how to raise sheep, which was, from a man like that, a form of respect close to reverence. Wilma died the following autumn, in October, in her sleep, in the bed she had been born in 87 years before, with the first blanket pulled up to her chin. Ada found her in the morning and knew before she touched her, the way you know, and she sat down on the edge of the bed and did not cry right away, because grief in the renter, women came slow and stayed long, and she just sat and held her grandmother's cool hand and looked at the blanket, which had done for Wilma at the very end the thing wool is for, the thing it had always been for, which is to keep a body warm through a cold and lonely dark. Ada buried her beside her husband and her father's father in the little fenced plot at the top of the pasture, where the whole hollow spread out below, and half the county came, which surprised Ada until she understood that Wilma had known everyone for 87 years, and had outlived most of them and been at their weddings and their funerals and their bad winters, and that the county did not forget a thing like that. Loretta came, and Ruth drove down from the north, and Corliss the hauler came in his good suit that smelled of mothballs, and Barrett the weaver, and Josie, who had become like a daughter, and Dale Pruitt stood at the back with his cap in his hands again, and afterward, at the house, the women filled the kitchen with food the way they do, and it was warm and full and loud with the low talk of people who have known each other their whole lives. That evening, when everyone had gone, Ada went up to the attic, to the cedar trunk, and she got out her great-grandfather's ledger, and she read again the line he had written across 60 years. "When the fast money is gone, the slow money will still be here in the wool. Tell whoever comes after, don't let them tell you it's worthless." And she understood now the 2 words she had never fully understood before. Tell whoever comes after. And she realized that he had not just been leaving her instructions, he had been leaving her a charge, a thing to pass on, the way Wilma had passed on the twist of the wrist that made the yarn come even, the way Ruth had passed on the setting of the warp, the way Barrett had passed on 30 years of weaving to Josie's young hands. The knowledge was not a possession. It was a river, and she was only a stretch of the bank it ran along, and her job was to keep it running clear to whoever came after her. She sat on the attic floor in the lamplight where she had sat 3 years before, and this time she cried. For Wilma and for her great-grandfather she'd never met, and for the strange folding of time that had brought his words down through all those years to reach her at exactly the moment she needed them. And then she wiped her face and went downstairs and wrote in her notebook, in her plain, upright hand that looked so much like his now, "Tell whoever comes after." And she began, the next week, to teach Josie everything she knew, not because Josie needed a trade, which she did, but because the river had to keep running. The farm did not become an empire, and Ada never let it try to. She kept it the size a farm should be, the size one woman and a handful of good hands could tend well, and when the demand outran what she could honestly supply, she did not borrow against the future to chase it. Instead, she did the thing that was truest to everything she had learned. She found other people on other worn-out ridges around the county and then beyond it, people with a little land and no prospects, and the same flat-braced faces Josie had worn, and she sold them starter flocks from her heritage breed at a fair price, and she taught them the shearing and the sorting and the care, and she connected them with Ruth and Barrett and the growing web of weavers, and she built, without ever calling it that, a thing that was less a business than a return, a bringing back of a whole way of living that the fast money had nearly erased. The breed that had almost died out spread back across the hills where it had always belonged. The wool that had been worthless became, within a decade, a thing people drove hundreds of miles to buy, and a thing that put roofs back on farmhouses and kept old families on old land and gave 16-year-olds with lost farms a future to grow into. Ada did all of it the same way she had done everything, one animal, one fleece, one blanket, one person at a time, by patience and attention and the refusal to rush, and she never once ran an advertisement, and the county never stopped telling the story, and the story never stopped being true. There is a photograph that hangs now in the gas station next to Loretta's register that Loretta will show you if you ask, and probably if you don't. It was taken years after the auction at the county fair, and it shows Ada Renner, no longer young, standing at a long table draped with her blankets in every natural shade of gray and brown and near black, and beside her stands Josie, grown now, and a young girl of Josie's who is learning the twist of the wrist, and there is a line of people that runs out of the frame, a line of people who have come to buy, and if you look at Ada's face in that photograph you will see that she is not looking at the line, and she is not looking at the camera. She is looking, the way she always looked, at the wool itself, at the thing everyone had thrown away, with the same quiet, steady attention she brought to it. The frozen morning she paid $7 for 300 sheep nobody wanted, while a man laughed so hard he had to take off his cap. She had understood before anyone else that a thing is not worthless. It is only waiting for somebody to need it again. And she had been the one who waited, and she had been the one who saw, and in the end, reality itself had risen up and proved her right, not with an argument but with 2 feet of snow and 40 years of forgotten warmth come flooding back into a county that had almost let it die. If this story reached something in you, do me a favor and send it to someone who's been told that what they have or what they are or what they're building isn't worth much. Because sometimes a person just needs to hear that the overlooked thing is the one that was worth everything all along. And I'd truly love to know down in the comments whether there's something in your own life that people wrote off before it proved them wrong. Because those are the stories I live for. Tell me, too, where in the world you're watching from, your town, your city, your own quiet ridge somewhere, because I read every single comment that comes in, every one, and I like knowing exactly where these stories are keeping people warm. Until the next one, take care of the things everyone else has given up on. They have a way of surprising you. Long after the fair photograph was taken, on an ordinary morning in the 4th year that felt like nothing at all. Until you counted forward from the beginning, a bank man came up the ridge to Sudden Hollow in a canvas coat. He was younger than the last one and nervous, and he had come not to foreclose on anything but to ask a question. Because the bank and the county seat had heard, the way even banks eventually hear things, that a foreclosed flock they had priced by the pound and nearly given away had turned into something the whole county now spoke of, and the bank wanted to understand how, so it would not make the mistake again. Ada met him in the yard and looked at him for a long time before she answered, the way she looked at everything, and then she took him into the 90-year-old barn, where the square true beams still held after all those winters, and she pulled a fleece from the pile and put it in his hands and said nothing, and let the wool make the argument it had always made better than she ever could. The bank man worked it between his fingers the way Corliss had, the way the broker never had, and his face changed the way faces changed, and he said quietly, "I've never felt anything like this." Ada said, "Nobody had for 40 years. That was the trouble." He asked her what she'd seen in them that morning at the auction that nobody else had seen, and Ada thought about it honestly, because she did not give easy answers, and finally she said, "I didn't see anything. I just didn't look away." And she told him about her great-grandfather's ledger and the line written across 60 years, and she watched him write it down in a notebook of his own, and she almost smiled at that, at the sight of a bank man copying down a dead farmer's wisdom, because it meant the river had found one more stretch of bank to run along. When he had gone, she stood in the barn doorway in the low gold light and looked out at the flock spread across the pasture. Her family had held for 4 generations, the descendants now of the torn-eared ewe she had almost named, the fleece on their backs worth more than the whole farm had been worth the day she came home, not because she had a plan. Josie's daughter came running up the lane from the road with the mail, and among the letters was one from a woman 3 states away who had gotten one of the blankets somehow and wanted to know, please, how she could learn to raise the sheep herself, because she had a little worn-out piece of ground nobody thought was good for anything. Ada read it twice. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table where Wilma had counted out the coffee can, and she took up her pen, and she began to write back slowly, in the plain, upright hand that looked so much like her great-grandfather's now, that she sometimes startled herself. And she told the woman yes, she would help. She would send a starter flock in the spring. She would teach her everything, one thing at a time, the way it had to be taught. She wrote at the bottom the same words she wrote at the bottom of every such letter now, the charge that had come down to her and would go on past her, and she did not underline them because they did not need it. Don't let them tell you it's worthless. Then she signed her name and looked out the window at the sheep, and the light held a while longer on the ridge before it went, the way it always did, patient and sure and unhurried, keeping the warmth in the last of the day.